Scientists just sequenced the oldest human DNA ever recovered from Egypt, and buried inside it was something nobody expected. Proof that roughly 1/5 of this man's ancestry came from over 1,000 kilometers away, from the region we now call Mesopotamia. Not trade goods, not borrowed symbols, people. Actual human beings who made that journey, settled among strangers, and had children. And until this result came back in the summer of 2025, nobody had ever been able to prove that with anything more solid than a shared pottery style or a familiar hieroglyph. This is the discovery that finally proved it, written directly into the DNA of a man who lived roughly 4,800 years ago, right around the time the first pyramids were rising out of the desert. Start with the moment he was found, because it deserves to be pictured properly rather than skimmed past. It's 1902. A British excavation team working under archaeologist John Garstang is cutting into a hillside necropolis at Nuweirat, a village roughly 265 kilometers south of Cairo, under the kind of dry, relentless Upper Egyptian heat that turns a full day of careful digging into a battle against dehydration and failing light by late afternoon. Workers would have started before dawn, when the temperature was still bearable, hauling baskets of loosened sediment away from the cut face by hand, the work slowing to a crawl by midday as the sun climbed directly overhead, and the limestone underfoot radiated heat back up through worn sandals. Garstang's approach to fieldwork was methodical by the standards of the era, cutting through accumulated sediment layer by layer, recording context rather than simply hunting for saleable antiquities, which is precisely the discipline that kept this particular tomb intact, rather than scattered by careless digging or looting decades earlier. The rock face here is honeycombed with tombs cut directly into the limestone, and the air inside each one, once the ceiling debris is cleared, would have carried that distinct underground stillness, cool relative to the surface, dust hanging visibly in whatever thin light the workers' lamps threw across the chamber walls, the outside glare replaced almost instantly by a close, shadowed dark that swallowed sound the way open desert never does. Somewhere in that hillside, diggers break through into a chamber that had sat undisturbed for close to 5,000 years, and inside it they find something that stands out even against a site full of burials, a large ceramic funerary vessel, sealed and deliberate. When it's opened, the skeleton inside is folded into the fetal position necessary to fit, knees drawn to the chest, positioned exactly as whoever buried him had left him. The pottery itself likely cracked carefully rather than shattered, the way a team trying to preserve a find for study, not just extract it, would have worked. To the excavators standing in that chamber, this would have registered as one solid find among many from a productive season, worth careful recording and shipment home, not an obviously singular discovery. Pot burials weren't unheard of at sites from this period, and nothing about the bones themselves would have visually announced what they contained. Nobody in that tomb in 1902 had any reason to suspect they were looking at what would, over a century later, become the single most genetically informative skeleton ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The remains were donated by the Egyptian Antiquities Service, under British administration at the time, to Garstang's excavation committee and crated for the voyage to Liverpool. They settled first into the collection of the Liverpool Institute of Archaeology, and eventually into World Museum Liverpool. And there, for well over a century, almost nothing happened to him. Picture the room he likely spent most of that century in. Rows of steel shelving in a climate-controlled but otherwise unremarkable storage area, cardboard and wooden boxes stacked and labeled with accession numbers rather than names, the quiet hum of museum storage where thousands of unglamorous, uncatalogued human remains from 100 different excavations wait, sometimes for decades, for a research question that finally needs them. His box carried a label referencing Nuweirat in Garstang's 1902 excavation, one line of provenance among countless others in a room most visitors to the museum never see. He sat through the First World War. He sat through the Second World War too, and by sheer luck survived it. German bombing raids during the Blitz tore through Liverpool and destroyed a large portion of the museum's human remains collection, entire shelving units and their contents lost in a single night. His box, somehow, wasn't among the casualties. He outlived an empire's worth of history, sitting quietly on a shelf, waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet, until, sometime in the last several years, a researcher pulled that box down again, this time not to catalog it, but to ask it a question nobody had been able to ask before. That researcher was Adeline Morez Jacobs, and her own path to this project is worth knowing, because the discovery wasn't a single lucky afternoon in a lab. It was years of unglamorous, frequently failed work. Morez Jacobs carried out this research first as a PhD student at Liverpool John Moores University, working directly with the bioarchaeological collections held there and at the affiliated museum, and later continued the project as a postdoctoral researcher at the Francis Crick Institute, where she became the study's first author. That kind of career path, moving from a doctoral project into a hosted postdoctoral position specifically to keep pursuing the same specimen, is not the norm in academia, where projects usually end when a degree does. It reflects just how much time the single skeleton demanded before it gave up anything usable. A doctorate typically runs 3 to 4 years. Carrying one specimen's genetic analysis across that boundary into a second, separate research position means the question mattered enough, and the early signal from the bones and teeth was promising enough to justify institutional support well beyond what a single degree normally allows. Ancient Egyptian remains have a well-earned reputation among geneticists for producing failure after failure. Samples that come back too degraded to sequence, samples contaminated with modern human DNA from over a century of handling by curators, conservators, and researchers who touched the bones with bare hands decades before anyone thought to wear gloves for genetic preservation rather than simple hygiene, samples that simply have nothing left to read once the degraded fragments are filtered out. Getting from "we have a tooth" to "we have 8 billion clean sequences" is not a single afternoon's work. It is years of repeated extraction attempts, quality checks, and false starts, most of which end in nothing publishable at all. Failed batches quietly set aside, techniques adjusted, and the same tooth, or a different tooth from a different skeleton entirely, tried again months later with a slightly refined protocol. Moores Jacobs has since described the actual technical breakthrough in plain terms. Rather than developing an entirely new method from scratch, the team filtered out the shortest, most degraded DNA fragments, the ones too damaged to yield anything reliable, so that the sequencing machines could focus their effort on the higher quality fragments that remained, combining several of the most effective existing techniques into one carefully optimized pipeline. When a clean, high-coverage sequence finally assembled on screen, after years of samples that hadn't worked, it marked the difference between another entry in a long list of failed Egyptian DNA extractions and the very first complete genome in the field's history. As she put it herself, once the results were in, piecing together the clues from this individual's DNA, bones, and teeth together allowed the team to build a genuinely comprehensive picture of who he'd been. A sentence that, read against years of failed attempts behind it, carries considerably more weight than it does on its own. Here's what makes the fact that this ever worked at all so remarkable. Getting usable DNA out of an ancient Egyptian body has been considered close to impossible for the better part of half a century. DNA is a fragile molecule, and heat is its enemy. Every cell carries a copy of the genome, but from the moment an organism dies, that molecule begins breaking apart. Long strands fragmenting into shorter and shorter pieces, chemical bonds degrading, and in warm environments, that breakdown accelerates dramatically compared to what happens in cold or stable conditions. Egypt is one of the hottest, driest environments on the planet. Brilliant for preserving papyrus, catastrophic for preserving the genetic material locked inside bone and teeth. Worse, the very burial practice Egypt is most famous for actively works against preservation. The oils, resins, and chemical treatments used in mummification break down DNA even faster than the desert heat does on its own, essentially embalming the body while simultaneously destroying the one thing modern researchers would eventually want most from it. Scientists have known about this problem for decades. In the 1980s, a young Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo attempted to pull DNA from Egyptian mummies and came away largely empty-handed. The samples were too degraded to work with, and some of what he did recover later turned out to be contamination from modern handling rather than anything genuinely ancient. Pääbo didn't abandon ancient DNA research. He simply moved to friendlier climates, and in 2022 won a Nobel Prize for sequencing the Neanderthal genome, work made possible largely because Ice Age Europe preserves DNA far better than the Egyptian desert ever could. Egypt itself stayed maddeningly out of reach for decades after him, treated by much of the field as close to a lost cause. The next real breakthrough came in 2017, and it's worth understanding exactly what it did and didn't achieve, because it sets up precisely why the new era result matters so much. A team led by Johannes Krause and Wolfgang Hock, working out of the Max Planck Institute and the University of Tübingen, successfully extracted genetic material from 151 mummified individuals recovered from a site called Abu Sir el Melek, roughly 100 kilometers south of Cairo, drawing on remains that had been housed for decades in anthropological collections at the University of Tübingen and a museum in Berlin. It was a genuine milestone. The first time ancient Egyptian mummies had been proven a reliable source of authentic, uncontaminated ancient DNA at scale, using bone rather than the soft tissue researchers had previously relied on, since soft tissue is more likely to still carry embalming preservatives that interfere with sequencing. From that sample of 151, the team recovered 90 complete mitochondrial genomes, the smaller, more abundant genetic material passed down only through the maternal line, and 3 full genome-wide nuclear datasets. The complete genetic blueprint researchers actually want most. The results reshaped how researchers understood Egyptian ancestry. Rather than the modern Egyptian population being a simple, unbroken continuation of the ancient one, the study found these mummies were most closely related to ancient populations in the Levant and Anatolia, genetically closer to the Near East than to sub-Saharan Africa, and that a meaningful shift toward greater sub-Saharan ancestry among Egyptians only occurred within the last 1 to 2,000 years, likely tied to increased trade and population movement along the Nile in more recent history. It was a real scientific advance, widely covered at the time as the first solid genetic window into ancient Egyptian ancestry at all, but every one of those remains was mummified, and every one of them came from a tight window between roughly 1400 BCE and the early centuries CE, the New Kingdom through the Roman period. That's a huge span of history, genetically speaking, but it's still a small, late slice of Egypt's roughly 3,000-year run as a civilization. It told researchers almost nothing about the earlier chapters, the era of unification, the early dynastic period, or the Old Kingdom when the pyramids themselves were built. That entire stretch remained a total genetic blank, because nothing that old had ever survived the country's climate intact enough to sequence. That's exactly the gap the Nuweirat man fills. And why his particular burial mattered so much. He escaped the fate that destroyed nearly every other candidate almost by accident. He died before mummification became Egypt's dominant burial custom. So his body was never treated with the chemicals that helped destroy DNA in the Abusir El-Malek mummies. Sealed instead inside a solid ceramic vessel and tucked into a rock-cut tomb, his remains were likely shielded from some of the worst heat and moisture swings that normally shred genetic material over thousands of years. It wasn't preservation by design. It was a lucky accident of timing and geology, and it happened to leave behind exactly what modern science needed, reaching back roughly 16 centuries earlier than any Egyptian genome sequence before him, straight into the era nobody had genetic access to at all. Once his genome was fully assembled, the ancestry breakdown became the headline. About 80% of his genetic material traced back to ancient populations in North Africa, while the remaining 20% traced back to populations in West Asia, specifically the Mesopotamia region, the area now covering parts of Iraq, Iran, and Syria. This wasn't a discovery landing on an empty conversation. Egyptologists had been debating exactly this kind of connection for the better part of a century, based entirely on physical, non-genetic evidence, ever since Naqada period sites first started turning up objects that had no obvious local origin. Cylinder seals, small carved stone cylinders originally developed in Mesopotamia to roll repeating impressions into wet clay, used there for sealing documents and marking ownership, begin turning up in Egyptian archaeological contexts during that same Naqada period, the centuries immediately preceding the man's own lifetime, alongside artistic motifs and architectural techniques such as recessed brick paneling copied almost stone for stone from Mesopotamian temple facades that closely mirror styles from cities hundreds of miles to the east. Scholars have argued for decades over what that pattern actually meant. Trade contact, diplomatic exchange, small groups of migrating specialists, or simply distant cultural imitation passed along secondhand through many intermediaries, a design copied from a design copied from a design, with no direct population movement at all required to explain it. One especially concrete example ties directly back to this man's own body. The potter's wheel itself is understood by archaeologists to have originated in Mesopotamia, gradually spreading westward along established trade corridors before arriving in Egypt only shortly before his own lifetime, meaning the very technology his skeleton suggests he spent decades operating was, itself, an import from the same region his ancestry partly traces to. Every one of these clues pointed toward contact. None of them, on their own, could prove that actual people had crossed that distance rather than simply their goods and ideas. This genome is the first evidence that settles that century-old debate in favor of real human movement. Not cultural diffusion passed hand to hand through trade networks, but families, mixing deeply enough that the genetic signature is still legible in a skeleton dug up thousands of years later. Which brings us back to his body, and to the part of this story that's genuinely a little uncomfortable to reconcile. Being sealed in a ceramic vessel inside a rock-cut tomb wasn't how ordinary Egyptians were buried in this period. It was a style associated with people of real social standing. Everything about how he was laid to rest points towards status and resources. But his skeleton, read as one continuous piece of evidence, tells an entirely different story about how he actually spent his life. Seat bones, noticeably widened and reshaped from decades of sitting on a hard surface for hours at a stretch. Forearms and shoulders carrying the muscle attachment scars of thousands of repeated back-and-forth motions. The base of his skull and his upper spine, shaped by years spent hunched forward and looking down. The exact posture, as one researcher on the project put it, of someone glued to a screen today, except his screen was a spinning lump of wet clay. And tying the entire picture together, advanced arthritis concentrated specifically in his right foot, matching almost exactly the repetitive kicking motion needed to keep a foot-powered potter's wheel spinning at a consistent speed. Taken individually, none of these signs would mean much. Stacked together in one body, they leave very little ambiguity. This was a craftsman who spent decades of his life at a wheel, shaping wet clay hour after hour, well into his 50s or 60s, until his joints simply gave out from the repetition. Potters in early Egyptian society were skilled laborers, not aristocrats, and rock-cut tombs with ceremonial vessel burials generally weren't extended to people doing that kind of physical work, which is exactly why bioarchaeologist Joel Irish, who examined the skeleton, called this burial unexpected for someone in his likely profession. Early dynastic and Old Kingdom Egypt was structured and hierarchical, and burial customs tended to reinforce class boundaries almost as rigidly as law did. The size, location, and construction of a tomb functioned as a fairly reliable signal of where a family sat in that hierarchy, which is precisely why archaeologists lean on burial style as evidence of status in the first place. But movement between classes wasn't unheard of, and this era does preserve at least one famous case that shows exactly how far it could go. Imhotep, who served under the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Djoser, only a short stretch before or around this man's own lifetime, is remembered by tradition as a commoner-born official who rose to become vizier, chief architect, and high priest, credited with designing Egypt's first great stone pyramid at Saqqara, and who was eventually deified centuries after his death, an honor almost never extended to anyone outside the royal line. Historians debate exactly how humble Imhotep's origins really were, since much of what survives about him comes from later legend rather than contemporary record, and it's entirely possible his early biography was embellished by later generations eager to celebrate a self-made success story. But his story, however embellished over time, proves the underlying possibility existed within Egyptian society during precisely this window. A talented individual could, under the right circumstances, climb dramatically beyond the station they were born into, and be remembered for centuries afterward for having done so. Bioarchaeologist Joel Irish's explanation for the Nuweirat man's own burial follows that same logic, offered carefully as hypothesis rather than certainty. That he was skilled or successful enough over a long working life to earn the patronage of someone genuinely powerful, or to rise to head a workshop trusted with commissions valuable enough to buy his family a funeral his profession alone would never have guaranteed. Isotope analysis of his teeth filled in one more detail. He almost certainly grew up locally in the Nile Valley, eating the wheat, barley, and animal protein typical of the region and period. His Mesopotamian ancestry wasn't the result of his own migration during his lifetime. It was already there, inherited, folded into his family line at some earlier point, possibly generations back, possibly through more than one wave of mixing between the two populations. He wasn't a traveler himself. He was living, breathing proof that his ancestors had been. Bringing his face back into the room took a separate kind of expertise entirely. Forensic anthropologist Caroline Wilkinson, who leads the face lab at Liverpool John Moores University and has previously reconstructed the faces of figures including Rameses II and Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe IV, worked directly off a 3D scan of his skull, building his likely features, jawline, nose, eye position, from statistical relationships between bone structure and soft tissue depth that forensic science has refined over decades of casework, often originally developed for identifying unknown individuals in modern criminal investigations before being adapted for archaeology. Skin tone, eye color, and hair color came not from guesswork but from the genome itself, which pointed toward brown eyes, brown hair, and darker skin consistent with his ancestry. There's a specific point in this kind of reconstruction that people in the field describe as distinct from everything leading up to it. The moment a set of measurements and averages stops looking like a mathematical model and starts looking like somebody specific. Eyes settle into their sockets. A jawline finds its exact angle. And what had been an anonymous ancient skull sitting in storage for over 100 years turns, on a screen, into a face, weathered, plainly aged by decades of outdoor labor, unmistakably one particular person, rather than a generic stand-in for ancient Egyptian. For a team that had spent months buried in base pairs and ancestry percentages, that moment reportedly landed very differently than any spreadsheet result could. This wasn't a data point anymore. It was somebody's father, quite possibly. Somebody who had bad knees by 50 and still went to work anyway. So, what happens next? The researchers involved have been explicit that a single genome, however remarkable, cannot represent an entire civilization on its own, and outside experts who reviewed the study agree. Daniel Antoine, head of the Department of Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum, who peer-reviewed the paper, called the finding highly significant precisely because ancient DNA so rarely survives at all in the Nile Valley, while also noting plainly that it rests on one individual, a caveat that matters as much as the discovery itself. Morez Jacobs herself has framed the path forward around the specific question this genome could only partially answer. Her own stated hope is that future DNA samples recovered from ancient Egypt will help pin down exactly when this movement of people from West Asia into Egypt began, and whether it happened as one identifiable event or as a slow trickle spread across many generations. That means the immediate next step for the field isn't a single-name dig, but a broader hunt for more burials sharing this man's specific advantage. Pre-mummification remains sealed in protective vessel or rock-cut contexts from comparable early dynastic and Old Kingdom sites across Upper and Middle Egypt. Now that this study has proven such conditions can preserve a genome intact. Every candidate site with similar burial conditions instantly becomes more valuable to researchers than it was a year ago, simply because this study demonstrated what those conditions can actually yield. Every additional genome recovered under those conditions adds another data point to a question. This first result could only gesture toward, was this Mesopotamian ancestry common throughout the Nile Valley at this time? Or was this man's family genuinely unusual? Was it concentrated in certain professions or regions, or spread evenly through the population? The technical wall that kept those questions unanswerable for nearly 40 years has finally come down. What gets built on the other side of it is now a matter of how many more Nuerit-style burials researchers can find. For over 100 years, this man sat boxed in a museum, surviving world wars and waiting on a science that hadn't been invented yet. When it finally arrived, it didn't just give him a face back. It rewrote a piece of the story historians thought they already understood, proving that the connection between two of the ancient world's great civilizations wasn't only carried in cargo holds and borrowed symbols, but in the blood of people who crossed a continent, built a life among strangers, and quietly left a fifth of their ancestry sealed inside their great-great-grandchildren, waiting patiently for someone, thousands of years later, to finally learn how to read it. He never knew any of that would happen. He simply worked a wheel, raised a family, and was buried the way his community judged fitting for the life he'd led. Everything else, the ancestry, the mystery, the century in a box, the face rebuilt from bone, is what happened to him after the part of his story he actually got to live.